Thank you all for coming to the first lecture of this lovely day. I have the great pleasure sitting next to me, Francisco Lopez, who is an experimental artist, musician, sonicist, and many other things. His music is his art is very specific, so I thought it might be best to start with a composition that he made in, was it 1997? Called La Selva. And I guess we should just go ahead and play it. And while he's playing it, I'm going to put some images up on the screen of some of the places that have been central to your work through the years. And we'll explain what that means afterwards. In the interest of time, we're going to only play an excerpt. It's about a 70-minute piece. We'll only be playing about 65, 69 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this lecture. And as Todd mentioned before, this is a fragment from a composition or a piece, sound piece that was made from recordings, straightforward, non-mixed, not transformed recordings from the rainforest in Costa Rica, where I lived and worked for a number of years. And we wanted to start with this because the rainforest, for me, has been a transformative force, has been a very extremely influential experience. And I've been working in rainforests all over the world for a long time. This is an image from the Amazon in Brazil, where I do a residency workshop every year in the rainforest as well. And
why are you in the rainforest? How do you get there? What got you there in the first place?
Well, I'm also a biologist, and I've been doing research in biology and teaching biology for many years. So somehow my life has been a part of life. I like to say Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, for a number of reasons. Between research in biology and sound and music. And those two things have been in parallel my entire life. And so my experience of the rainforest is the experience of somebody who is working there and is spending extended periods of time in the field. And because of this, because of being exposed to this, to the richness of these environments and sonic richness and many other aspects, but in particular in relation to sound, I was originally drawn to the rainforest because of research in biology, but at the same time, from the beginning, I was doing also recordings, sound recordings. And among other things, something that is peculiar, and very important in the rainforest is that it's an environment that is extremely rich. It has all this incredible complexity of sounds, and it's this 24-hour constant changes, and it is the variety of things is incredible, and the range of things is incredible too. But you don't see the sources of all this complexity, all this sonic complexity. It's basically, I like to say, a naturally acousmatic environment, meaning a place where you have an amazing sonic display all the time, but you cannot see what are the sources of all these sounds. So it's an invisible world, basically. And it is pretty much like that for the organisms who live in this environment, because they basically have to predate each other and escape each other, and they survive in this environment by listening. And so that's one aspect of the rainforest in relation to sound that had an extremely strong influence in my work.
One of the things that was so loud in that recording were the cicadas, I think, or at least, and it's one of the animals in the rainforest that you hear very loudly, but you almost never see them. It's like right in front of your face, but you never actually get to see them. It's a very strange experience, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we were in this recording, for example, we're hearing lots of frogs, of course, many different species of frogs at the same time, in the way that they naturally happen in this particular environment. and also cicadas and leafhoppers that produce the highest pitch, the highest frequencies, and some birds and a bunch of other things. Like most of these things, even in the case of the cicadas, especially daytime cicadas, some of them are extremely strong, loud, and you can hear them very, very close, but it's almost impossible to find them in the forest. So you have this paradox of this intense, rich, in-your-face experience, while you cannot identify, but not find visually the sources of all these sounds. And that, as I said before, is the intense, perhaps paradox and beauty at the same time for me of this natural environment.
One of the things that's most interesting about this recording, and I think it's a good way to sort of talk about your approach to music, is that you decided to tell people exactly what you did and exactly where you were when you recorded it. And with a lot of your other recordings, you don't do so. You try to create a situation where you have no expectations necessarily going in, or you try to create that situation. Why did you decide with La Selva that it was important to let people know?
These are, to answer your question, these are images from different locations all over the world where I've done field recordings, because this is what I do. Spend my life traveling around and doing recordings in all kinds of places, not only rainforests, not only natural environments, but also cities and man-made environments and artificial environments of all kinds. But there is a paradox, and to answer your question, there is a paradox here again, which is I am not interested in representation. I am not interested in soundscapes in the sense of representing reality. I'm not doing recordings because I want to simulate or reenact or recompose or listen again to this reality. I don't believe in this. And the more I work with reality, so-called reality, the more I am convinced that this is a futile attempt at reproducing reality. To me, what is interesting in this back and forth between this reality and the sounds, compositions, artificial ways of reproducing sounds, and so on, and I can show you examples of ways in which I do this, is actually a very complex interaction with a substance of reality that comes from reality in those sound recordings, in the same way that a photograph is a very intricate relationship with a reference to reality that is not about reproducing that reality, but it's about exploring the substance of reality. In other words, this is a phenomenological approach to the connection with reality. I'm interested in the substance of reality, in texture, in complexity, in richness, in virtual space, in the idea of space that we have from reality, in the idea of time that we get from reality. And all those things are not necessarily representational. In this particular piece that I played a fragment at the beginning, La Selva, what I did, there's a CD release of this piece, and what I did is there's a lot of information in the booklet of the CD, but the booklet is closed, and at the beginning there's an indication, there's a short text advising the listener not to open this booklet, not to open this information. This I did this way, and I've done it in different ways, this strategy of allowing the listener to decide to go into a path of no return when you have information about something that, in this particular case, comes from reality. Because once you know about this, your way of listening to these sounds will change. And this is a natural process, and this is a normal process. Because we are obviously influenced by what we know, and what we know, especially when we're dealing with real, so-called real sounds, we are definitely influenced by what we know in the way we listen to things. So, but because there's a reality to this experience, and because there's a reality to the place, I wanted to have, in that particular case, the information about the place. And then it's in the hands of the listener to decide how much, or when, or how, or if you want to actually access that information in relation to your listening experience.
How do we, you seem to have a very fully formed philosophy about these things. How did we get here? How, when you were growing up in Madrid, right? You were listening to what type of music, and what led you down this path?
Well, I think I've always been interested in music or in sound, perhaps more than in music. And I did other kinds of music before. I started doing this kind of work in 1980. And before that, I was actually played drums. I was playing in different bands. And this is the sort of post-punk times, new wave, punk. And I was interested in all kinds of different music all the time, those kinds of music. But I always had this other thing, this other interest that I couldn't really realize or develop in a band. One of my frustrations in playing in bands was that, to me, there was always a compromise in between the different members of the band. There was always a compromise in, I like this, you like that, let's do something in between, kind of thing. There was also an extreme limitation if playing with instruments, with what I felt I could do with sound and what I felt I was hearing in this reality when at the time I was already doing recordings, sound recordings. And to me, there was always this extreme difference between the possibilities of working with any sound in any imaginable way, of course with the technology at the time, which was completely different to what we have today, obviously, and what you can do with instruments. So to me, there's nothing wrong, obviously, about instruments, but the field, the range, and the possibilities, to me, of working with sound were much wider, very different, also very different rules in reality, in the way sound unfolds, in the way sound it happens in reality, dramatically different to what happens in the instrumental realm in general. So from the beginning, I had always this feeling that I wanted to do something. It was unclear to me what it was exactly, but I wanted to do something that related to that complexity and to that richness of reality that was, in my view, way beyond instruments.
Were there certain bands that sort of opened your eyes to the idea of, okay, this is a possibility, or these people are doing something that is something worth exploring further?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the early industrial music was one of my references. I started listening to, of course, the Splendor Geometrico, this band from Madrid. In fact, we knew each other even before that, because we actually grew up in the same neighborhood in Madrid. And then other bands like Throbbing Gristle, of course, SBK, Maurizio Bianchi in Italy, Hunting Lodge in the States. So at the time, there was this small constellation of different bands of industrial music that were not exactly connected to this kind of work with sound recordings, but they were definitely experimenting in a direction that I found very appealing, very towards more abstract, more obscure perhaps, but also, to me, more open ways of dealing with sound, and also in a way that I had the feeling, and at the time, the people who were working in this area had the feeling that more or less anything was possible in terms of aesthetics, not technically, but in terms of aesthetics, or a lot of things were possible that were different from the tradition of rock and roll and pop culture. And to me, and also from other traditions of music, of course. So to me, that was very appealing. And to me, that was a territory where you could really more or less do whatever you wanted to do and then proceed with your own path. And this is something that, of course, took place then later on during the 80s with cassette culture. I was very, very involved in cassette, so-called home music networks and cassette culture at the time. And within that network, international global network of people working with homemade music or cassette music, that was the territory for doing whatever you wanted to do. It was really anything. So that was basically I don't have any proper musical education or technical education for sound, but that was my school, let's say. These international communities, change and collaboration by mail with many different artists all over the world.
And what did some of the first things that you were producing sound like? You weren't already field recording in the 80s when you're doing these cassettes, were you? Or were you?
Yes, but also I was, from the beginning, I had this feeling that what I had in the recordings was something quite different to the original thing. Not only because, as it normally is understood, it's not the real thing. This is what most people will say. Well, a recording is just a recording. It's not the real thing, for sure. But we need to look at this in different ways, because sometimes what you have in a recording is better than what we have in reality. And this was, in an intuitive way, this was my feeling from the beginning. I always had the feeling that in the recordings were a different world. And we're a different world, not a deficient world. It was a world self-contained with its own rules and with its own parameters and with its own richness, that in many respects it was actually better. One of the reasons why I think this world of recordings might be better than reality is in the following sense. The machines that we use to capture reality or things from reality, they have a big advantage, that they can do something we cannot do, which is they don't think when they perceive reality. And this is something we cannot do. We have to do incredible things around it in order to try to get close to anything like that, perceiving reality without thinking. And so our perception of reality is always cognitive, and is always, not only because we have prejudice or besides that, is that we are thinking creatures. And we basically see reality through modals. And we don't see reality, we don't hear reality. Now, machines within the range of a microphone, within the range of a digital encoding or whatever it is, they don't think. And this is a massive advantage. So my point has always been, many years ago in an intuitive way, today perhaps more elaborated because of the experience, it's always been that we should cooperate with the machines. We should stop criticizing them because they're deficient, and we should cooperate with them. This is what I tried to do. So my feeling from the beginning was this kind of feeling. In the same way, because I was not interested in representation, what I did with those first recordings was to start working in the development, in my personal way, of this other world made with substance from reality. This independent, self-sustained, self-contained world from that substance of reality. And in fact, I have an example of that I did one of the first sort of, at the time I wasn't thinking of this as compositions, but one of the first things that I did by transforming in a very crude, in a very rudimentary way, by working only with cassettes, only with cassette recorders, and extremely limited technology. I didn't have a studio, I didn't have any mixer, of course no computers, but also no good equipment to record, just fiddling around and messing around with the cassette recorders. And I can play for you an example of that transformation of reality.
What is it called?
Untitled. Like most of my pieces are untitled, but these are also untitled. Thank you. This is from 1980.
It seems, again, it seems strange to me that, or interesting that you had this philosophy that seems almost fully formed so early on, that you had this idea that the possibilities are endless, that the scope needed to be broadened somehow. And I'm wondering how you came to this so easily, it seems.
Well, I think at the time I didn't have really, couldn't articulate these ideas as I perhaps can do today, because it was more of a gut feeling. It was first thing my taste, I would say, for sound, as it was the case of a number of other people. Meaning taste, meaning the direction you want to create, the things that you find appealing, and then the feeling that what my interest in the recordings, the reason why I was interested in doing recordings, was not related to this question of just reproducing those environments or places or voices or people, whatever it is, but more of an, as I said, intuitive and clear idea or feeling that my interest was in sound, actually, and the texture of sound, and this other world that was starting to unfold. At the time, I wouldn't say it this way. It wouldn't be so clear to me that I was trying to develop a different world. I was just working with the sounds and going in the direction that I found most interesting to me.
You said that was called Untitled, and a lot of your work is untitled. In 1997, I think it was, you sort of made a break and did not title almost anything after that, for the most part. And I'm wondering why.
Well, most of the pieces that I did during the 80s were untitled. They had no titles. Then at some point, there's a number of reasons. I'm not giving names to pieces or releases. It's always, it triggers a whole discussion, and it triggers also a whole social, some social issues. Social meaning that, for example, you have to struggle with record labels. And record labels don't like this because they like to have some kind of description. Actually, in one case, in one extreme case, I had a release that was coming out in a record label, and we didn't do the release in the end because the record label, the people in the record label, they told me, well, this Untitled thing, you've done it before, so we don't want to call this CD Untitled. You should put a title. And to me, this was it's a funny situation because I'm not doing this because I want to do one statement one day and then next month I will be doing something different in a different realm. To me, the question of not giving titles to pieces is a fundamental question because I believe that contributes somehow to not giving clues to the listener as to what is the purpose, what is the meaning of this particular release or piece. I believe the meaning or the possibilities of any recording are actually open to the listener to decide what it is and to have his own or her own experience of sound piece. And so that's the reason why I do this. And but then you have the struggle and the conflict with a number of different situations. Record labels sometimes, for live presentations, concerts, sound installations, there's always this question of, but what is this? Or what do you mean? Or what are you expressing? And I'm one of those people who believe that I'm not expressing myself through the music. That's not what I try to do. So I'm in this constant sort of struggle. And whenever I can, my ideal situation will be to have everything Untitled. That will be. And this is one of my latest releases, and it's Untitled 275. So I'm managing to do it, more or less. Some of the cases, what I've done is a different strategy that has to do also with this confrontation with reality, which is when some pieces are being created in a place, I just give the name of the place, and then it's up to the listener to decide what is the connection or what it is that we are hearing, listening in connection to that place. Like the case of La Selva, which is the name of a place in Costa Rica.
You also did one release or a number of releases where you were in buildings in New York, which you also, I think, titled that, correct?
Yeah, that was a project with sound environments from large office buildings and apartment buildings in New York. The sound environments in the buildings, of the machinery of the buildings, the heating systems, electrical systems, elevators, and all that. And the name of the release that came out from that is called Buildings New York. And it's clear that it's made in certain buildings in New York, and it uses only the material that is not transformed, and that's it. Now, what is the connection of that, and what are we hearing when we listen to that? These are the question that was mentioning before about not being representational and so on.
Let's talk a little bit about your live shows. You are they're infamous. I guess would be the best word to describe them. You often have people blindfolded and sitting down, and you try to minimize yourself as much as possible in terms of being seen and people seeing what you're doing. It's very similar to your records in a way, in that you want people to draw their own conclusions. I guess it's all part of the same process, trying to allow people to have that experience where they have to, they can put their own stuff onto what you're doing and not be told what it is or how it's being made.
Let me bring this gentleman here to explain this for a minute for me, because he can give you a summary of what I do in their version.
כאן בשבת האחרונה הגיע לכאן אומן מוזר לחלוטין, לא יודע אם הוא אומן או די-ג'יי. מדובר באדם שמושיב את הקהל, משמיע להם מוזיקה אלקטרונית, אבל כולם צריכים להיות עם כיסוי עיניים. המוזיקה הייחודית, בואו נראה קטע קטן מהמופע של פרנסיסקו לופז בשבת בישראל. הנה. יכול להיות שזה נראה כמו חקירת שב"כ או כמו איזה משהו מטלטל במיוחד, אבל זה היה מופע פשוט מדהים, ממש מופע מיוחד מאוד. יושבים יותר מ100 אנשים במרתף חשוך, עיניהם מכוסות, והאיש הזה, פרנסיסקו לופס, שהוא אומן ספרדי, שהוא גם ביולוג וגם אומן של מוזיקה אלקטרונית, מביא מוזיקה מרחבי העולם, מיערות גשומים, מאנטארקטיקה, מקליט אותם, ממקסס אותם, והקהל מאזין, וזה להיט. וזו חוויה של שעה, זה קשה להאמין שזו חוויה מאוד מרגשת גם, זאת אומרת, אני מנסה לא להיות ציני.
Well, I think that gave a sort of news version of what I do for television. But yeah, I think he's right in a lot of different things, because what I've been working on for over the years is in a reconfiguration of the situation for listening, meaning first a reconfiguration of the space, performative space. I refuse the use of the stage and the configuration of the stage, which means not only not being on stage, but also sort of moving away from frontal sound systems. I use surround systems with multi-channel systems normally, and I don't have my system, but I adapt to different spaces. And these are examples of performances, the arrangement of the space in very different spaces in different countries, in which I, within the limitations of the spaces and within the possibilities of different spaces, you see a very clear configuration of the seating for the audience as well as the equipment. And so normally what I do is I'm in the middle of that space, and I'm in the middle, let's say, with the audience, meaning that I want to hear more or less what the audience is hearing, and I cannot be on stage following the sound through monitors, which is a typical, prototypical situation for a lot of different music on stage. And because what I do live is I work with sound. It's not only that I produce sounds with instruments, but I transform the sound, and I tweak the sound, and I manipulate the sound as a physical phenomenological entity in the space. So I need to be where the audience is. And this doesn't mean that every single person in the audience is hearing the same thing. Obviously, there are differences in the space. This is a different story. But my reconfiguration of the space has to do with, first, that aspect of being with the audience in order to hear more or less the same thing. Second thing is that the audience is not looking towards the center, as you can see there, but they're looking outwards, basically, let's say, facing the speakers are around that configuration. And then by doing this, and I've done it in many different ways, in different spaces, I try to generate basically an immersive experience in sound that has to do with this configuration, and that happens also in the dark with blindfolds for the audience. This reconfiguration of the space and this play with different spaces and different systems is something that I've been doing also in a combination of performances and sound installations in many different ways. And these are some examples of sound systems in different spaces. This is from an installation with 250 speakers in the Spanish pavilion of an expo that took place in Spain a few years ago. And this is an amazing system for moving sounds around, but it's not so good for having a good presence of the sound relative to the space. But this is another story, perhaps. And this is a recent installation I did in New York with a system with 100 speakers in 2 concentric domes in a space, and that concert hall with only with rainforest recordings from many different places in the world that were turned into a hyper-real rainforest. In fact, the name of this performance installation is Hyper Rainforest, because it's not representing the rainforest, but it's using the elements of many different rainforests to create an extremely hyper-realistic, beyond the normal representation experience of the complexity of these materials. This is a very much more modest installation in a forest in France, with filtering of frequencies of insects from different forests and turn into a very subtle, very small, one person at a time installation in the forest. These are examples of many different, and this is an installation that I did here in Matadero 2 years ago, with these extremely comfortable recliners that we used for try to obliterate the presence of the body somehow, and to some extent that happened. And I was using a combination of speakers and headphones simultaneously. So we had speakers around this configuration of seats, of recliners, plus additional listening through headphones in an interesting combination, because when you combine those two things, you can do a lot of interesting things. And also I've done some literal immersion underwater, some concerts underwater with speakers underwater, which is a totally different realm for many different reasons, because the rules of acoustics underwater are extremely different. And the rules of behavior and the possibilities for listening are obviously also very different.
What did you do there? I'm fascinated by that. You spent quite a bit of time underwater researching how the acoustics are different, I assume.
Well, I wanted to spend more time than I actually had the opportunity to, because this is a concert in London in a pool organized by a collective of people in London who organizes performances underwater in different pools across the UK. And it's an incredible opportunity to do this very unusual kind of performance. But unfortunately, we didn't have that much time for sound check, a few hours only. So, and doing a sound check for this is quite complicated, because you have to jump in the water and then back to the mixing board and back to the water and back to the mixing board and so on. And
you have to dry off completely before you're touching that mixing board.
Well, I wasn't doing that,
okay.
But obviously. And even during the performance, I was jumping in the water and I was listening to some parts and I was coming back out of the water. It's such a new territory when you work with this, and when you had to do it quickly, like in this case, it's like you do whatever you can do. And I did whatever I could in the time that I had. But to me, what was interesting about this experience is the realization that how interesting it will be to work with this with more time and with more dedication, with more being true to the different nature of what happens underwater. Underwater, it's very difficult to localize the source of sounds, which might be an advantage, of course. It's very difficult to drive low frequencies. You need to, because of the density of the medium, so you need like extremely powerful speakers to produce low frequencies underwater, which normally doesn't happen with the most underwater speakers. And then stereo is not stereo underwater, so you have a completely different set of rules. And that, I think, it needs to be explored with more time than in these performances. Well, I selected many materials that I thought will work well underwater because of these features of the acoustic environment, and I think more or less I succeeded to some extent with that experience. The other factor is obviously that people cannot be diving for too long, so they have to be going down and up and breathing and then swimming and moving around. In addition to that, the water here was very cold. And this was a performance that with other performers that took place over the course of like a couple of hours. And after a couple of hours in cold water, it was quite a challenge to be there listening. So there's a number, but I learned a lot from this experience, and what I will do if I had another chance to work underwater. And yes, well, the component of the blindfold. The blindfold is something I started using.
When did you start that? At what point did you either have the power to say, this is how we're going to do it, or say,
I think it was in the mid-90s when I started doing this, when I realized that it was impossible to get a space that's completely dark. To get a space pitch black, dark, it's very difficult, very, very difficult, much more difficult than it seems to be, because sometimes when you turn off the lights, everything seems to be dark, and after a few minutes you start seeing things, of course, because you get used to the darkness, but also because I'm typically in the middle of the audience and I have equipment with lights, so in fact that turns into the opposite. Because of this, I started suggesting the idea and providing blindfolds for optional voluntary use by the audience. All these people here have not been forced to be blindfolded. They did it voluntarily. And I always emphasize that at the beginning of the performance. So of course, is a crucial aspect of this, that to highlight the fact that I'm not forcing anyone to do this. This is an optional thing. And the other thing is that by having a individual darkness with a blindfold, of course, you listen better because you're not seen, and because we know that the visual component of our perception predominates or obliterates sometimes a lot of the hearing. But there's something else that happened that I didn't predict, I didn't expect, or I didn't plan, which is when this happens in this way collectively and voluntarily, there's something else, which is a sense of commitment, of collective commitment and voluntary acceptance of this way of this very unusual way of following a performance. But this creates somehow a collective ritual, game, or something like that that is voluntarily accepted, and it creates this sense, collective sense of commitment to the listening during that short time of a performance, and that to me is perhaps even more important than this aspect of not seeing and therefore listening better. So
it's something it seems like you already want from your listeners, and the stuff that I've read in interviews and things, that commitment more than anything else is to the music that you make is pretty important, and this is a very nice byproduct of the blindfold, that you get that extra commitment there.
Yeah. Yes, I would say so. I think I have a lot of commitment to what I do, and I'm not expecting anyone to or everybody to like what I do, by no means, and I'm not expecting everyone to follow these things if they don't want to. But for whoever wants to do it or wants to try it, I offer a lot of commitment, a lot of dedication, a lot of work done in order to create this experience. And I ask for, I don't demand this, but I think it will be, I think commitment is something that is sort of dissipating. When people think about for example, the overload of information, one of the problems that we think about is that we have too much information, we have too many things, we don't know how to focus our attention and so on. I think one of the consequences of this is not only this question of finding information or not, it's also the reduction or the decrease of commitment to individual things. And I'm not sure to what extent this is a problem or not, and I'm not sure to what extent we are adapting with different strategies to this, but there's definitely a question there that has to do with commitment. So what I try to offer is a very strong, intense experience with sound only, and then through that and with commitment, I think you can reach individually different territories that are personal, emotional, internal, that I have no control over by any means, that I think are extremely interesting territories. And I like to think of this, of course, the aspect of synesthetic experience. When you don't see and you're hearing things, of course, you start imagining things, or you start seeing things somehow. And but those things are very personal, and those things and that reaction happens naturally. And I like to think of this as I like to think of synesthesia as multimedia inside the body. So I'm more interested in any multimedia, intermedia, transmedia aspect inside the body than outside the body. And I think when you do that, when you voluntarily, temporarily refuse, you have some sense deprivation, what you discover is this multimedia inside your body or your mind or the combination of the two.
Do you have that experience when you're working on music, or is it just hard work?
I definitely have that experience when I work with music, both in my solitary work in the studio work, but also during live performances. I don't have studio. I never had a studio, and I don't have a system like any of the systems that I can use during a live performance. So for me, the live performance becomes a very interesting experience and very intense experience of having the sound in the way it happens with those systems and with those spaces and with that large-scale situation that I cannot do in any other way. So when I'm doing the live performance, I have a combination of enjoying this, experiencing this, which is different in every space and in every sound system, and having the responsibility of creating an interesting experience for all these people and not going beyond certain limits, meaning basically having a good control of the intensity, the contrast, and the dynamics in a live performance. It is my belief that a lot of people working with sound today, they don't really know much about sound. They know how to generate sounds. But after that, I see a lot of sloppiness in working with sound. And I think whoever works with sound in a live situation has the responsibility of not doing something too crazy that can, for example, damage the hearing of people. And as we all know, that's very easy. Small movements of faders or knobs can dramatically have a gigantic effect in what is happening in a live space. So for me, a live performance is a combination of excitement, enjoyment, and responsibility.
You mentioned the word just a minute ago, dissipation, and it seems like a word that's been a big thing for you over the years. You have this essay that you're working on or finished called The Dissipation of Music, I believe. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that means to you and why that's come to become sort of a central idea in your work?
There was a time in the 19th century during Romanticism in which a number of poets, not musicians or composers, but poets, sort of defended the idea, created the idea, and wrote about it extensively under the label or the description of absolute music, where they defended the idea that the highest form of art was music because music was ineffable, because music was something that could trigger all these emotions, could have all these different effects without meaning anything specific, without being about anything in particular, and without us being able to translate that into words. One of the questions they had was that they reached a point where they felt that poetry was limited by language in a way that they couldn't go beyond the language conventions and so on. I'm making a very crude description of this, but basically the idea was that if there is a form of art or creation that we have that is really ineffable, that we cannot really translate into words in an efficient way, in a good way, that is music. And music has this incredible potential. This was actually a reaction to, in the Western world, was a reaction to what happened immediately before up to the 18th century. Because up to that point, music was predominantly in Western culture used for operatic presentation, for opera, and for storytelling through opera, through the version of opera. And this was a reaction to that. This is a very brief moment in the history of Western music, this idea, because the 20th century, after that, the 20th century has been a lot about reconfiguring the ideas about how to structure music and where is music coming from, or where music can be coming from. And it's been a lot about breaking conventions of structure and breaking conventions of sources of sounds and what is music and what is not music. And in the process, I think this brief moment in the history of Western music has been an exception, actually, in which there was a moment where music was not about anything, and music was considered to be not about structure, not about technology, not about meaning, not about expression, or anything like that. So to me, as far as I know, this is the most intense moment, version, description, conception of music as something absolute. And it's absolute in that sense. And so this for me has been, I don't do music of the 19th century, or maybe I do. I'm not sure exactly, but maybe I connect more with that situation and with definitely with that idea for sure, than with any other ideas that I know of in the 20th century or in the 21st century. And so to me, the question of dissipation of music has to do with how much the experience of music in that absolute sense, in that very strong fundamental sense, might be dissipated by a number of things. One of them is a structuralist conception of music. And a structuralist conception of music applies not only to traditional music, applies of course to pop culture and to rock culture that are very traditional and they are very systematic about aesthetics and about structure and about styles. And then because of that, I have the feeling that I respect all kinds of music. I actually like many different kinds of music. But what I'm interested in exploring, and my direction and territory, has to do with the attempt at moving away from structure, technology in the sense of talking about it or showing it or putting it forward when making music, and moving into this other territory. I think it's clear with these examples that I'm following certain strategies in that direction. These strategies are not 100% efficient. There's of course problems with these strategies, but I am trying to find, or I'm working with the strategies that have to do with bringing the listener or the person who has experienced this into a territory that is, I will hope, a blank phenomenological territory of experience.
Do you regard people working today as your peers, people who are working towards the same things, the same ideas, that have the same philosophy? Obviously, you've done an enormous amount of collaborations, but I can't imagine that every single person has that same sort of philosophy about music. Are there certain people that you really connect with?
There's a lot of people that I connect with in terms of music making or sound making, a lot of them, and I've done collaborations with a lot of people. That is different to having the connection in terms of this idea of presentation and this idea of how to convey the music in a public situation, for example, or for a release, for a recorded release. That is different. Among those people probably will be John Duncan, is an American artist that has been working in the dark also for a number of years. He does it perhaps for different reasons and in a different way, but also he's very much into this idea of creating this. In his case, he works a lot with fear, for example, and with stress, and he puts people in very stressing and even dangerous situations. And I'm not exactly playing with that, but we share, there's a part of the territory that or the reasons why we work in the dark that is common to both of us, and we have collaborated. So perhaps his case is the more clear case in which we share this part of this.
As you mentioned, you have done an enormous amount of collaborations. I was looking at your website the other day, and it would take me probably 10 minutes to read the names of all the people that you've done things with. What are you looking for in a collaborator, most of all, more than anything else?
I suppose is the is the learning and the influence of something external, somebody with different ideas and with different elements, bringing those different elements into the making of something. I have the feeling that I don't so much need to have other collaborators, but every time I collaborate with somebody, I always learn something new, and I always have the impression that the influence has been at least partly a positive influence that brought things that we'll never imagine. So this is typical for music making in collaboration. So I would say that it's something very general thing to say in music, but it's something that definitely comes into the equation of why to do a collaboration. There's one aspect that is different to playing with instruments in collaboration, which is here when every single person in the collaboration can produce any sound and can manipulate any sound in any imaginable way, the contribution of somebody else is not equivalent to the contribution of adding one element or one layer or one texture that you will have with an instrument. And again, this is not to say that it's better than an instrument, but it's definitely the degree of transformation and the degree of contribution of somebody to the work that you're doing. It's quite wide, and it could be anything really. For example, obviously, as probably most of you know, or you practice, when you can record something, you pass it on to somebody else, that somebody else is going to do a transformation of that, it comes back to you, and so on, real time or no real time. And that kind of back and forth with the possibilities of transformation, it's so large and so big that definitely the interest of a collaboration has probably to do more with ideas than with contribution in terms of specific sound components to the collective group music making.
Could you maybe play 2 or 3 collaborations that you've done that sort of show the breadth of what happens when you work with someone?
Thank you. Thank you. This was made only with sounds from the piano, exclusively. And have another example, a short piece, is a short track, the 2 minutes, that I made with a friend from the Czech Republic that does a lot of recordings. And he gave me the recordings for this track. And so in that sense, it's a collaboration because this track is based exclusively on those recordings of a very simple thing that you will recognize immediately. Thank you. And believe it or not, this is my snoring, unfortunately. In the last example, just perhaps a couple of minutes, it's a collaboration with myself over time. Because what I did is, I did very recently, I took recordings that I made 30 years ago, and I created a piece out of those recordings by mutating, by transforming, and radically processing and evolving these things. So I was like looking at myself a long time ago, and then trying to get something out of that with the eyes of today somehow. This comes originally from also for you to have an idea of something very different, that in the sense that the degree of transformation of the sounds coming from originally from sound recordings of real things is extreme. And this has been through, I think it's also a good example of something I do a lot, which is many generations of transformation of sound. Like I transform a sound and they have the first generation, this first generation will be the beginning of a second one, and so on, and so on, and so on, which is a very common thing to do, but I do it very extensively. So this happened after, I don't know how many generations, but many of those generations, and turn into this thing that is, some people would say abstract. It's actually not abstract, it's very concrete, but anyway, very not real result of the process. Thank you.
So I think there's something in all of those to ask about. Let's start with the first one first. A piano player. Are you softening in your old age? Are you going to conventional instruments and making it plain as to what you're doing?
No, it's only when you're old that they think that you should, that they let you do the things like that, like a piano composition. When you're younger, they don't let you do it. And it's a matter of experience. And my work with musicians, with compositions for ensembles, like this is an example from Berlin, has to, I suppose, they only take you seriously after a while, at least in my case, that's the way it's been. And then after a while, if you're given the opportunity, and if you have any interest in working in this realm, they might give it a try. For me, this has happened after many years of having, as I described before, the experience of having the entire world of sound at my fingertips somehow. And then I've been exploring what I could do with an ensemble of musicians or with a piano player, and given the opportunity.
Was there a certain point at which you realized that you were getting taken seriously, that that you had entered into another sort of echelon of people, and the talk around you was somehow, it wasn't, oh, what is he doing anymore, and more, oh, here's experimental composer Francisco Lopez?
Yes, that happens. That in my case, that happened after many years. I spent many years, for example, during the 80s, I didn't do any performances. And I didn't do performances because, well, first because I didn't have any opportunities for performances. I was in Madrid during that time, and there was not really a place here. I remember people from the electronic scene of the time telling me that what I was doing was not music and it was not worth. I got refused, for example, a track for a compilation album that was on an LP that was released in Madrid, and of experimental music. And I was told that what I was doing was not music within that realm of experimental music. And in the same way, there was not really a place where you could do music live. But also, I thought that I couldn't do really music live because my work, I've always been sort of a studio person. And
what was the breakthrough?
Well, it was probably just start doing it, actually. And the first shows that I did were actually in the States. And there I discovered, through collaboration with different artists from the States, that actually you could, given the opportunity, you could actually do a lot of work live. And all what I know about performing live has to do from this experience and by doing it. And then I discovered by doing the performances that I could do a lot of work in a live performance, even if I'm playing with samples and with things that I have pre-recorded. But what I do, and you have to believe me that what I do live is a lot of work that is not generating the sounds, but it's transforming and specializing the sounds in a simultaneous parallel process of different controllers. And I have to do a lot of work. And all of this comes from the experience and the realization that, in fact, what is important to do live, to me, it's to work with the sound. And that requires a lot of work. That is not necessarily having a generator of sound, instrumental or electronic.
Has the technology enabled you to do that better over the years? Or have you always been able to do what you want live in transforming the sound?
Well, the change in technology has allowed me definitely to have more flexibility and to have a wider range. more quality in the final result. But also the portability is very important for me because I've been traveling and living in different places for a number of years. And this computer here is currently my studio and everything else. I don't have a studio. And this for me, it's in fact the quality of computers I like the most is the dematerialization quality of computers. I'm not a gear-oriented person. I use a lot of gear, but I don't like to have gear. And so I'm very happy that we're living in this time where you can do most of the processes that you need to do with a computer, with a laptop. And I'm not talking about, the only tools that I use are basically Pro Tools and a simple editor for sound like Peak or something like that. So it's not so much about the technology that comes from the computer, but the fact that you can do it anywhere and you can do it in a very simple way, in a very cheap way. And this, I'm very happy to live in these times because of this. So the changes in technology have allowed me to an enormous flexibility on where I can be and what I can do with very simple means. In the 80s, for example, the difference between professional technology for recording, both field recordings and studio recording, and let's say amateur technology, where the difference was gigantic. Today, and this difference has been narrowing down to a point where basically we're almost at the same point between what billions of people can have and what the professionals can have. And I think, in fact, the difference in price or in cost of equipment doesn't reflect the difference in the quality. I'm not talking only about the quality of the music, I'm talking about the technical quality of the sound. It's being reduced to a point where I think we're basically at the point where there's really no difference, and you cannot tell. And I will challenge anyone to tell me where or with what something has been recorded as a master. I do all the masters of all my releases currently in this computer, and I think the point is how you do it and how much experience. I think experience gives you a lot of ways of doing things in an interesting way, and not so much the technology. So definitely, technology has been the changes in technology towards what some people call democratization of technology. I like more socialization of technology. It's been a big change and a big relief for me.
The second composition you played, obviously, was you snoring and had sounds of you snoring. And I've heard I think another one where you worked with snoring as well, or maybe it was the same composition. Okay.
I'll make a confession. That was another composition that I made with the combined snoring of all of my ex-girlfriends that I happened to record over the years together. I suppose it's very symbolic, or I don't know what it means.
There's something in there. I don't think we need to go there. I guess before I knew that, my question would have been humor in your music. Is it there? And so. I laughed at the end of the snoring thing because it was just kind of hilarious to me.
I think to some extent there is humor. I think there's everything in what I do that has to do with, of course, with my limited personal subjective sense of humor or whatever. But I think there is always like a humor in different ways, sometimes less obvious ways than these examples. And yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And then in the last one, I was struck and reminded of how much, especially in more of your early stuff, silence plays such an enormous role. Tell me about a little bit on your perspective in using that as a force, as a sound, I suppose. Yeah, I've been using silence in as part of the compositions or the releases of the tracks in extensive ways, in different ways. Sometimes absolute silence, meaning digitally speaking, no recording, no sound recording. Sometimes quasi-silence, pseudo-silence, things that are very, very subtle, or the difference in dynamics between the average level in the recording or the maximum peak in the recording and the minimum is dramatic, like to the limits of what is audible. Both in the recording or in a live performance. And this I do to great lengths because I like contrast. I like the
the effects of contrast, and the effects of balance and dynamics. To me, this is very important. I think, well, there's this process that has been happening, and it took place mostly over the 90s of the so-called the loudness wars, in which production studios were applying compressors and different techniques of making the music, commercial music, sound louder, stronger for the radio broadcast. And this is a process that takes place, not only took place in this production realm, but also takes place in live performances across festivals and everywhere. And of course, there's a risk in this, which is losing dynamics, losing contrast, and losing strength because we don't have the contrast. With contrast comes strength, and strength in the impression that you can create, in the richness of the music or the performance that you can create, and that relies on contrast. Silence is sort of the extreme, the ultimate contrast you can have for sound. You can use it in many different ways, and I think it's a fundamental, I think it's obvious, it's a fundamental part of music, of all kinds of music. And I've used silence in extreme ways, like extreme meaning, for example, 10 minutes of silence in the middle of a piece. These creates like feelings of void or wandering and checking levels or checking the equipment sometimes, but this is not my intention. My intention is to have that as a fundamental component of the music. And the most typical reaction that I've seen to that it took me some time to understand is the idea that there's something conceptual about the work when there is silence. Every time you use silence, it seems that is related to somehow, because there's a tradition and there is a history of the use of silence that is conceptual, to something conceptual. In my case, I'm not trying to make a statement about void in music or any KG and John Cage related statement, but the opposite. And to me, it is a fundamental block of the making of sound, and probably the most clear way of that, or using that, is as an agent of contrast and dynamics.
In 2001, you wrote down a bunch of aphorisms about music and process and things, and you put it on your website, and they're all just sort of one-line sort of things, and a lot of them are really, really interesting. One of them that struck me quite a bit was, I work really hard to create useless things, and I'm proud of it. Can you, so you've created a lot of useless things in your career. Or
I hope so.
Why do you hope so?
Well, I mean useless in the sense of not having a clear application, not having a clear intention, not having a clear meaning, expression, or reason why those things are put out in the world. Useless in that sense. And as a contrast to a lot of work that seems to be put forward or presented as advancing something in the realm of music, for example, technically or aesthetically. So in that sense, I like to feel that those, perhaps useless in a philosophical sense, in the meaning, in the sense of creating this unknown purpose, unknown use for these things that I have no control of. So that has to do, it was in the context of having control or having expression or no expression with what you do.
What was happening in 2001 that you put down all of these thoughts and ideas?
I was working in Cuba, and if you work in Cuba, you become philosophical. That I can guarantee to anyone who travels. If you travel as a tourist, probably not. But if you work in Cuba and you live like a Cuban, you are bound to become philosophical.
You've traveled quite a bit, as you mentioned. You really don't seem to have much of a home base overall. Is this a conscious choice, a philosophical choice in your life?
Yeah, philosophical, personal choice. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I'm feeling comfortable. I mentioned before that I'm not a gear-oriented person. Well, I'm not an object-oriented person. I have problems with physical objects. I have problems, psychological problems with material things. I don't want to. It's not that I don't like things. It's that I don't want to possess things. In fact, the more I like something, the more I like somebody else to have it and possess it and to be responsible of it. I don't want to be responsible of physical things. So probably that's why it's my lack of responsibility or something like that. But that's probably why I'm also so much drawn into sound. Sound is immaterial, in its manifestation, in its physical manifestation. And at the same time, it's such a powerful thing. It's such a powerful force. It's such a physical thing, but it might be immaterial. And it is always somewhere in the physical support, yes, but we don't need to carry it, especially today. We can have the immateriality level that we're reaching allow us to bring tons of sounds and music in very small physical things. Or even we don't need to carry them, you know, they're in the cloud or whatever. So they're somewhere, certainly, but the amount of space and physical presence that they require is much less than paintings or sculpture, for example. And to me, this is a blessing. And this is definitely a blessing. So it has to do also with this allergy to material things.
Obviously, CDs have been an enormous carrier of information for you. You put out vinyl and you've done cassettes as well. Is there a optimum format, or does it just depend on the release in your mind?
No, it really depends on the release. I did a lot of cassette releases a long time ago, and well, cassettes are coming back, of course, because it's happening. And I will never, I'd imagine that there will be a resurrection of cassettes. But I think there's a resurrection of formats sometimes, or a combination of new formats and very old formats because of something else that has not to do really with music, but with other things. Nostalgia sometimes, and fascination by the object or the support or the technology. And I think each one of these today, if I do something, it will have to be adapted to the format. Like this vinyl release, for example, it's basically made with scratch sounds from vinyls. And so each one of these formats allows you to do different things, and I think it's good to react more or less to the medium that you have. CDs today are basically only left to the it's like a remnant of an industry that is not an industry anymore. And it was never an industry for experimental music, that's for sure. But it's only people who are interested in experimental music mostly or electronic music that have any interest in a physical support. Vinyl has of course, the coolness and the appeal of vinyl. That's a different story. And every format, perhaps the CDs in a few years from now, they will have also some kind of appeal. I think they already started having this sort of appeal of something old. And we are in that situation.
You don't seem like a very nostalgic type of person.
No, I'm not. And I'm always thinking of what I'm doing now or what I'm going to do next normally.
You have how many projects in the works right now? Because every time I seem to read an interview with you, I have 20 to 30. Making. Yeah.
Yeah, I work in parallel with many projects. That's the way I like to work. And right now, I don't know, maybe between 20 and 30 different projects that are in the making. Some of them collaborations, some of them recordings, field recordings in different countries, or I'm working with some cartoons right now. So I'm doing
cartoon
sounds, yes. So I'm working. I like to work in parallel with different projects, so I can have like a variety of things that I can do at the same time, and that enriches, I think, the result of each one of them.
What is the cartoon project?
It's a project with a filmmaker from Montreal, and he got permission to use the soundtracks from, including everything, dialogues and sound effects and everything, from all cartoons from the 10s, the 20s, and the 30s, which are on the National Film Board of Canada archive.
I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, your first sort of interest in music came from watching a puppet show and the strange sounds that were, or is that internet lies? No, it's not really from that episode, but I had this strong, as a kid, I remember had a lot of interest in puppets. I don't know why. They had this magical combination of being there, present somehow, and the mystery of the puppet show. And this puppet show that I was in, a bunch of puppet shows that I was in as a kid were not for kids. So it was not really entertaining. It was more scary, mysterious, and I got a lot of this. To me, perhaps was this other world that was happening there, that was alive, independent, and self-contained. Again, this idea of another world that I always felt very keen on and very well connected with this creation of other worlds. So somehow it was this sort of analog simulation of a different reality with storytelling that was driving me like towards this, not so much the music, but this connection with the creation of self-contained worlds. You're up to Untitled 275, and you have probably as you said, 20, 30 more projects. But what haven't you done that you are looking forward to, that you really need to get done at this point?
I have the impression that, one thing that always happens to me every time I start recording a new project is that I always get surprised. Because my way of working is never proceeds by having a plan beforehand, but it depends. Basically, all my work depends on the sounds themselves. And when that happens, and when you start combining or transforming or mixing or whatever it is with the sounds, you always get surprises especially if you don't have a plan beforehand, which is my case. And then, so what happens is that every single time I get surprised by things that I will never imagine that will happen in that process. So to me, it's very difficult to predict or to expect. I would say what I expect to happen, what I would like to happen, is that this process of surprise and discovery of new things keeps going the same way. And so far, until today, still the same thing. Now I discover new things. I look for other things that I wasn't looking before. But as a process of discovery, it still happens today. So my hope is that it continues like this forever.
Do you find yourself, though, descending into formula sometimes, doing this, 3 or 4 releases where you feel like I've kind of done that process over and over again? Or is it just that the sound object that you're working on is different, so that it's always a different end product, and even the same formula ends up with something radically different?
What I think is that it's interesting to compare the parameters to judge change in music for one artist or one band, compared to the work of other realms of creation, art, like painting, for example. In painting, a painter is never expected to produce a completely different painting every time he does a painting. He's expected to paint as himself or herself in his own style, evolving over the years, yes, perhaps, but he's not expected to produce a completely different thing every week. In music, there's this myth and this paradigm of constant, dramatic, brutal, restless novelty every month, every week, every release, every album, every person. I don't think we can create so many things. I don't think we can create a new style of music every week. And I don't think we, as individuals or as groups of people, as bands, or we cannot create something completely different every single release. And this is a myth. It doesn't happen. When you compare albums from the same people, you might be trying to do different things, but it doesn't happen. But my question is not this. My question is, why are we expecting this exactly? And it's unclear to me. I think the work that I admire from different people, it might be painters, it might be other artists, is one of the things that I appreciate is consistency and a solid body of work somehow. And with that vision, then to me the question is not so much novelty. It's not I did a new thing. It's more, what is the consistency of the world that you're constructing block by block, step by step, piece by piece. And this is the way I see myself mostly. So of course I repeat a lot of things that I do. I repeat the strategies, I repeat taste, I repeat a lot of different things that are clearly my style of doing things. And that style comes from a lot of influences, of course. And but to me, in terms of releases, for example, the question is an imbalance between the pace of creation of somebody and the pace of commercial possibility of marketing. Of course, this is not a business, but in terms of how many releases can you put out by different labels in 1 year. And then there's always this question, or there's this myth that if somebody's putting out, say, a lot of releases and quickly, then it's like, well, this guy's doing so many things that they don't have quality. It will be better to do less, but more quality. I don't see this. I'm not talking about myself right now, but I talk about other artists. And I see artists that produce very little, and it's not really interesting. And I see artists that produce a lot, and every single thing they do has something interesting. Whether or not they change is another matter, but I see it always interesting. I know some artists that record every day. And I know artists that are compulsive in their creative, and they have no interest. They're not concerned at all by production in terms of releases, but they record every single day, and they have thousands and thousands of hours of recordings and creations. And I think every person has a different pace. I wouldn't recommend anybody to follow a certain specific pace. You have to do 1 album a year, or you have to do 10 or 20 or 1 million. No, I think what is important and what is very difficult, actually, is to discover what is your pace. And this pace is independent of any commercial, social considerations. And you should follow that pace. Now, if you can release then what you have created, is a different story. But I think you should create at your own pace. And you have to, I think this is, again, one of the most difficult things to do, is you have to discover what is your right or correct or good pace of creation.
I wanted to end it before we open it up to questions from the audience with a potentially stupid question. What makes a good field recording?
The eye of the beholder. That's what makes a good field recording, because some people work in, some artists work with very lo-fi ways of approaching field recordings, and I am not. Since I think I made this clear, I'm not interested in representation. My point with recordings is not to do what they called a perfect field recording, because I don't actually know what is a perfect field recording. I have no idea what that is. What some people mean by that is different things. A sound technician working for a documentary, nature documentary, for example, will have an idea of what is a perfect sound recording. A musician can have a completely different idea, or an artist can have a completely different idea. There's no such a thing as an objective recording of something that is real. This is not, doesn't exist. But also, I think you have to relate that question to your intentions or your desires and your feelings.
What makes a good field recording to you?
I don't know, because every time I'm doing the field recordings, it's unclear to me.
The intention's always different for yourself.
The intention is not there when I'm doing the recording. The recording itself, for me, is the exploration of the first mining of things, substance from reality. And when I'm doing that, I don't know what will happen with that in the future. So when I'm doing the recording, it's unclear to me. I might have a preference for certain sounds, of course, and every person has a different preference. And then I might be drawn to certain things. Oh, this sounds good to me, and then I record it. But it's unclear to me what I'm going to do. And I can work, and I have worked with recordings with very simple, recorded with very simple technology. In fact, what I use today for recording sound, it's just a Zoom recorder that, as probably most of you know, it's a very cheap recorder that I think now is like 150 euros or something like that records in 4 tracks, but it's extremely simple, cheap, and that's what I use for field recording. So this is, by no means, this is a professional recorder, but I will challenge any professional recorder to tell me after the production and after the piece is done to compare qualities of, even from the point of view, the technical point of view of the sound.
Well, thank you. I wanted to open it up to questions, if anyone has one. Just wait for the microphone, which is slowly making its way.
Hi. From what I understand of your philosophy towards your recordings, marrying your sounds with film would almost be like blasphemous, but would you ever consider working with a filmmaker, maybe doing something collaborative?
Yeah, the second part of the question is the key, making something collaborative. Because when you work with filmmakers, and I have worked with filmmakers and with dancers and with other people, it's not the normal work that I do, but occasionally I've done it. And my impression is that it's always the same problem. The same problem meaning that whatever you do when you work with sound and images, especially in film, it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what you do, it's the soundtrack of the film. And that's not a collaboration. That I wouldn't call a collaboration. If in film, there's of course because also film has this military hierarchy that is very clear, and the director of the film, it's the director, is the boss, is the supreme person in the making of the film. If you do a collaboration, hand to hand, like close, intimate collaboration, real collaboration, I'm not talking about putting sounds to images. I'm talking about taking decisions, for example, for the images and the structure of the images according to the sounds, and so on, back and forth. If you do that in the context of film, you're going to have a hard time having your name at the same level than the film director. And this is not about, I want to be there too. It's about what is the real collaboration here or not. And this is the problem that happens in relation to film that is not so much related to the medium, but to the tradition of the presentation of the medium through film. And I have had this problem a few times. So it's not so much that I worry about not having the same size of letters than the director. It's not so much about that. It's that there's no acknowledgement that the making of that thing was made as a process that was also the images could have been influenced by sound and vice versa.
So would you be more willing to do something maybe uncredited for both parties and maybe do it under a pseudonym for both?
That's a solution. That's a possible way of doing it. But you need to. The problem is here is not so much working with the person. You might have a very good understanding with the person who is the film person. It's more the industry or the environment or the cultural environment and the way it's presented. Anytime there's a film being screened, there's a film director, and then there's all the other things. And it's very difficult that you convince or you present or you show that the work has been done. Even if you put it very clearly, it's very difficult that it's understood that way. So it's more the context, the social context of the presentation of film that makes this difficult.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, respect your very deep knowledge about the sound. I just really want to know, like, entire of the universe full of the sound, like always a different sound around us. So I just really want to know, is there any standard for you? Like, is it a good sound or is it a bad sound or something's interesting for you? I just want to know.
Good or bad sounds, you say, or songs?
It's like, is that what kind of things for you is like interesting sound for you that really pleasured you, want to know more about it?
Well, the thing is that you can look at this question in different ways, because sometimes what you hear in the sounds is what you're feeling at the moment of what you hear. And sometimes with experience, what you hear in the sounds is the potential of something. So sometimes when you're listening to something or recording something, you're imagining the potential of this something that is not there as it is in the sound, but then you can say, okay, with this I could do this or that. You start imagining. And then so the answer will be different depending on how you're dealing with those things. I would say in general, I'm interested in any sounds really. And I've recorded all kinds of things really, because my experience in the studio, and probably most of you have this knowledge and this experience, is that you can do the different transformations you can do of sounds will allow you to go in many different territories, and the potential of this substance is there for many different types of things. The only thing that I think is important to answer your question is that I try as much as I can to look at these things, to hear these things as much as I can as they are, meaning out of the cultural context, out of the natural context, and listen to them as sounds, which is a very difficult thing to do. And this brings you into a completely different realm. For example, I have no fascination, and this is a very common thing, for fascinating sounds because of the source of the sound. A lot of people get fascinated by the fact that, for example, an animal is producing this incredible sound. It sounds like electronic, okay? And then this cicada from Japan, for example, in Japan, the cicadas there produce these incredible sounds that sound like really electronic music. And then, it's incredible because it's a cicada. All right, that's a fact, and that is a surprise, and that is an acknowledgement of the fascination for this thing in reality. That there's nothing wrong about it, of course. But then I try to separate myself from this level of fascination into a different level. So in that other level, I don't really care where the sounds are coming from. And when the sounds are out there, they can be sounds. They are not. There's no such a thing as the sound of a frog, if you know what I mean.
Also another one, like you played some of your stuff before, like some of the sounds sounding really interesting. I think some of the producers in this room might interesting if they want to sample your sound to make music, is gonna be cause any problem?
No, just a bunch of money, and then I'll be happy to talk to anybody.
Thank you.
No, I haven't got any money still. I still have to get some money from samples, so it's a joke.
How you doing? I had two questions. I didn't know which one to ask first, but as far as like your first experience recording like live nature sounds in the rainforest, like when did you decide to go in your mind and go, I should share this with people? Like when did that moment happen that you decided to want to develop this crazy system of blindfolding people and sitting down and playing them what you've experienced?
It's something that happened over the years. It's step by step. It wasn't the final configuration with the arrangement, with the system, with the blindfolds. Everything happened step by step, and it happened by learning from experience in performances and by struggling also with the possibilities of presentation. You always have to struggle with this, particularly in music environments. It's a paradox also that theater environments or gallery or art environments are sometimes, in terms of reconfiguration of space and changing those rules, are much more flexible than music environments. I've seen things like graphic equalizers for the control of the sound in a space blocked and locked, so I couldn't access that. And which in a club music, and I understand why, but to me this is crazy. So I have to struggle with all these different restrictions, and then try to bring in the elements one by one until this more or less this configuration that is viable and is still evolving. And it depends on the space. So I would say that I started being able to do performances in early 90s. And since then, very quickly, I got into adding this or trying to bring in these elements very quickly in the early 90s.
My last question is, it feels as if a lot of the sounds that you played are kind of like transcendent, kind of like spiritual in a sense. Have you ever been interviewed and asked, like, how do you feel emotionally about being able to spread it, and do you feel like it's spiritual, like when you listen to it and when you're producing it?
Well, definitely, yeah. I think you hit the important point, because it is for me a spiritual activity fundamentally. I'm not a religious person in any specific particular religion sense, but definitely to me, music, sound in general is an extremely powerful force that is obviously connected in the entire history of humankind with spiritual realms in many different ways. And to me, it has the potential of spiritual transformation, whatever that means. And I also see that happens to a number of people in performances or sound installations in a very strong way. So it definitely has a very strong spiritual component for me, yeah.
I was quite interested by this blindfolding. It's something that I've been fascinated by myself a lot of times, just to stop somewhere and close your eyes, like if you're just walking in the street. One thing I noticed in my hometown was that there are trams, and in the wintertime when there's snow, the sound from like the audio without all the resonance that comes from the hard surface normally. Just to experience this is really cool. But I had this experience of a flotation tank. Have you been in contact with this? Is it something you have been working with for performances?
No, because my experience, I've tried flotation tanks 3 times in 3 different places with 3 different systems. And I saw them. My impression is, my experience was one of extremely limited possibilities. One is obviously the sound systems they have. When they have sound systems, they are really crappy speakers that are horrible, and the sound is terrible. So that's completely useless. But my other experience, and it happened every single time, is that you're drifting when you're floating, very slowly. You're very slowly drifting. So as you're floating there and you don't feel your body and so on, by very slowly drifting over half an hour, you end up touching one side of the chamber. And then if you push a little bit to separate from this side, it's just a matter of time, maybe half an hour, you will touch the other end. So my mind was basically busy with this idea of trying to forget the actual environment. It was not an environment where I could really, because of a number of restrictions. Also, you hear a lot of things that come from the outside. For somebody who is aware of sound, you hear a lot of stuff coming from outside. And so there's a number of limitations in the flotation tank that I think it is interesting, the aspect of getting your body the same temperature and so on. There's some elements there that will help to go into that direction. But there's other elements in that configuration that don't really allow the experience to go much further than that. So I was a bit disappointed by the experience.
Yes, in a way, it's the extreme void of input from the environment around you kind of makes you more aware of also the sensory and everything else than just being maybe sitting and blindfolded. So yeah,
I think that's why commitment is so important. Commitment, awareness of what you're trying to achieve. Because, of course, if you have a blindfold, you might feel the blindfold on your face and things like that, you know. You sit in, you could be laying down, you could be, it doesn't matter how you do it, you can always be aware of things that are happening that are interfering with experience. So I think what is crucial is that, in fact, you have to be in sort of the mood, or you have to be with the intention. And this has to be intentional, conscious, and active. Like if you want to do meditation, you have to do it actively. You need to learn, and you have to do it actively, and you need to practice this. And this requires training and effort and so on. So this is equivalent in that sense. It's like that's how it's possible to do meditation anywhere, anytime. You know.
Hi there. I'm interested in the concept of at the start you talked about kind of other worlds or other realities. Do you see yourself as exploring or revealing an existing, kind of existing world when you're recording sound and then manipulating it, or is the point to kind of create an entirely different world? Is it accessing a real other reality, or is it creating another real reality?
This is like the metaphor some sculptors use, that the form is already there, is in the materials, and we just bring it out. This is a very old idea, actually, about creation and art, and it's been always there as a discussion in the history of creation. And so I suppose it is within that entire big question that we're talking about here, meaning that I don't believe that I'm creating an entirely new thing. What I'm trying to do with that substance from reality, it is connected, obviously, in terms of the materiality or the materials that I'm using. It is also connected in terms of the structure. For example, one of the things that is important to consider when working with field recordings is not actually what people call samples or sounds. There's no such a thing as a sound as an individual entity. What we have is a flow, especially from the point of view of the machines. For a machine, a recording machine, there's no sounds. There's a constant flow of sonic information, and there's no difference between different individual entities. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a connection with that world. But what I'm trying to do is to work in a way that is not representational. It doesn't need representation. It's not aimed at representation, and therefore can have its own separate life, connected with reality, obviously. But the aim of this creation is to generate something that has a little life on its own. Let's put it that way. If you want to be modest, then you say, well, there's a little new world that I'm created. And then it is connected, of course, and is related to many different things. But my aim is to generate this thing. And this little thing is also aims to be a territory of exploration for others. So it's not a final thing. It's an open gate into a territory. And this is the way I like to see it and the way I try to do it. So when somebody else enters that territory, being a listener or a person who is experiencing the sound, then it is the responsibility of this person to create in that territory. And I'm one of those people who believe that the most fundamental act of creation when it comes to sound or music is not producing sound, it's listening to sound. So the creation act, it's generated and it's produced and it's not finalized, but it keeps going on with that listening. And then what is the creation? I'm not sure. But I try to create a blank territory where you can enter that, and in that sense, is a little different world that somewhere you can explore and you can go in.
Yeah. So the creative act is almost walking through the door.
This is my belief to some extent. Of course, this is not an objective door, and it's not an object. It's not a neutral, absolutely neutral, and it couldn't be. But I'm offering somehow this particular subjective door that will lead somewhere, not everywhere, will lead somewhere, but then I don't know what it is, that territory. This is my point.
Thank you.
Hi. The first piece you played was about 70 minutes in total, I believe. I'm just wondering if you're interested in these kind of concepts of like vertical time or non-linear type music, and perhaps what is, say, the longest session or piece of music that you've worked on?
Well, there's of course, if you work with structures of generating sound or combining sound that are basically endless, like of course you can do generative things or whatever. then it's endless. It's an endless piece. Some of the installations that I show images of, they basically have sound sources that are endless. So it just depends on the time of the installation.
Great. And shortly, as the second question, there was a slide that was on the screen briefly with a bunch of blindfolded performers. I think I saw a violinist and a pianist, a guitarist perhaps. I was wondering if you could talk to us about that.
Yeah, this is an ensemble from the Martin Altina ensemble from Amsterdam, with whom I worked recently. And I did a composition for them blindfolded, so the musicians have to play blindfolded. And obviously there's no score, but also there's no visual cues that they can follow. So what happens here is that, and this composition was not improvised, and it was not random. We did a lot of work in order to make the composition. I worked with all the musicians. I had the time to work with them. And then the composition is made for them according to their possibilities and their styles and their ways of playing. And we did a lot of work in terms of hiding the cues for change, sometimes for very radical, sudden change in the music, that were not audible for the audience unless you know the piece very, very well, and unless you know the every single element that is happening, which will be basically impossible. So the musicians could hear, so it's turning the cues, the whole structure of cues, visual cues or written cues, bringing those cues into the music. And then it's audible for the musicians who know the piece, and they will know how to change, because this is one of the things that I was interested in creating, sudden changes, surprising changes in the music. Again, contrast, and that was one of the important elements in this composition. So basically, because they were blindfolded, they have to be listening to each other very, very carefully.
Great, thank you.
Hi. I'm interested in your use of spatialization, and you place yourself in the center, and you said so that you can hear more or less what the audience is hearing. But one of the difficulties in working in spatializing sound is that generally speaking, the center is the sweet spot, and people sitting on the outer edges will have usually a bias to a speaker in front of them. Do you have performance methods to try to create an overall even experience for all of the listeners?
The center is the sweet spot only if the music is designed that way. Is designed, and that's an idea that comes from partly, well, there's a strong influence that has to do with film and with the design of sound systems for film, because you have a focal point of attention, and then you have things around that. In the music, it has to do with the idea that there's the things are going to move around a fixed position. So anyway, my strategy is that the things that I do in a live performance are not designed, and they don't take place with one point of reference. So there's no point of reference, and what it is, there's a play with the space, and that play is free in the sense that I can do things that move around in different ways without that single point of reference. That's my point of listening, and is reference only in terms of what I can hear, because I cannot move during the performance in this case, but only in that sense. So the actual composition or the performance is not based on one ideal place for the listening experience. For example, my recordings are not multi-channel recordings that are already set up in a way, and then I play them, and then they happen in the sound system. I've never done this, in fact. But they're flexible, and I can move them around in the space. So somebody who's sitting on the edge actually can have a great experience, because that person is receiving at certain points in the performance better listening than other people in the other side, and so on. This also applies for even for sound installations, and in which the automation of the sound installation, if there is such a thing, then is designed in a way that there will be not one single point in the space where that will be ideal. And that was the case of this installation, for example. So here there is a center, of course, but the center was not the best place for listening. It depended on when in the duration of the performance there were different points that were better than others. So I worked with this because I'm not working in these cases, I'm not working with a piece or that is designed as such.
Thank you.
A couple over there. Just have 3 more, I think.
All right. Forgive me, I was out of the room for 5 minutes, so if you've already answered a variant to this question, I apologise. But I just wanted to know, are your ears constantly searching for sounds? And that's to say, you know, as opposed to most of us, do you find yourself in everyday situations, like say, for example, you go to the supermarket, and whereas most of us will be in a supermarket, we're shopping, whereas for you, it's an orchestra of sounds?
That sounds like this film, the man with X-ray vision or something like that. That in the end he becomes crazy because he can. No, it's not like that. No, but you're right in the sense that sometimes. I mean, I would say, thanks God, I think I'm not in that situation because you will go mad probably. You will go crazy. But it is true that many times in the most unexpected situations or places you might find something like nobody will notice or most people will think is irrelevant, and then you find it, oh, this is really incredible, this little thing or this little sound. Typically it's little things actually, because the little things, the big things everybody notice somehow, and the small things is something that is less obvious or whatever. But I would say I'm not the only one. I know a lot of musicians and musicians that don't work with recordings, but they play instruments in different ways that have this kind of listening. And they say, oh, wow, this is very nice little thing here. And so I suppose it's related to, obviously, to the experience of working with sound. And but you cannot carry on with that in your daily life 24 hours, of course, yeah.
Hi, I think we had some great insight on your thoughts on the music that you make and your process and the whole thing. But I'm actually also very interested in your thoughts on the music that you don't make, like popular music, both in terms of recording and performance. Where do you see it going? Where would you like to see it going? And do you think it's converging or diverging from the kind of music that you make?
I have to say I'm very bad at making predictions. And every time I try to make a prediction, I always get it wrong, to tell you the truth. So not that I care if I do the wrong prediction, but I don't know. I don't really know. But my impression today is that, as you said, there's a convergence in the sense of the mix and the cross-breeding in between different territories. This is definitely clear, and is happening on a massive scale, and it's been happening on a massive scale for a number of years now. So there is definitely this crossbreeding and this influence that goes back and forth. You see in a lot of pop music, for example, commercial music, you see things today, you hear things today that will be unthinkable just 10 years ago or 20 years ago, completely unthinkable. So that is clear, that is this how do you say, this influence, this little thing, that is probably just a little thing, there's a little detail in the music. For some pop artists, it's more than a little thing, but yeah, it's getting there. There's also another question that goes the other way around, which is a lot of the people working in experimental music today, their background is not academic. They didn't go to study in conservatories or the equivalent or laboratories of electroacoustic music. Their background is rock and roll, pop music in a wide sense. And this is their background. This is my background, actually. And because of that, the ways of doing things, the aesthetics, the directions, the ideas, sometimes the flexibility, sometimes the speed of change and doing things is completely different and is fed by this background. And this, to me, it's crucial. It's very important because, in my view, in my opinion, the most interesting music, or let's say experimental music being done today, is done by people without any proper musical training. And to me, this is very important because it means something quite fundamental. And actually, it has never happened before in the history of music making. Or it happened a long time ago. And then we lost it in the process, and perhaps we'll recover in this stage thanks to this paradoxical combination of the accessibility of technology. It's not only the technology, it's also that socially today it's accepted that anyone doing something, at least you can do it. That doesn't mean that you're going to be successful or whatever, but they let you do it. There was a time, and I lived through a time where you were not really, you couldn't really do it. You will have no chance of presenting or showing or whatever. And this, I think, is more important than anything else, because then that means that we are in the middle of a massive social process of change, and this is out of the hands of anybody controlling the direction, and is more of I definitely see it as a social process. So I don't know where it's going, but what I know, what I feel is that today it's thanks God, the music is off the grip of musicians and composers.
Thank you.
You were talking earlier about the surprise and the unexpected. Is that an important element when in the process of getting closer to a more real reality?
I'm not sure, because the unexpected has many different manifestations. One can be, or different realms. One could be what you find in so-called real world, and that is unexpected. And then there's all these other unexpected things. I find more unexpected things of that world when I'm in the other virtual world of transformation, creation, studio, whatever. I find more unexpected things in that world. But that is perhaps because I've done a lot of exploration of the first world, and then in the second world, there's always new things. And so I would say it is a combination, and it's not technological. To me, this is interesting because the technology that I use is actually very simple. And I don't believe that we have generated, with all the technological changes, software, for example, I don't see, this is my opinion, but I don't see a lot of changes in sound through, definitely it doesn't go in parallel with the changes in software. The changes in the software are dramatic. The speed of things, the number of things, the number of possibilities, the parameters, the ranges, everything is dramatic. It's brutal, it's gigantic. Now, what can you get with that in terms of changes of sound? I don't see that much change in sound because there's a limit for our hearing, there's a limit for a number of things, and you can go into other territories that have to do, not with sound, have to do with other things, with meaning, with the context, with how you place the sounds and so on. So unexpected, I think there's a limitation for the unexpected in technical terms, and it has to come more from the way you tweak with those things. And then unexpected can be for you, and maybe not for somebody else. But to me, what is interesting, in short, is that how is it possible? Sometimes I wonder that I can be surprised and find these unexpected things when the tools that I'm using are the same tools, actually. And it's been the same tools for quite a long time. Now, the process of this happening of the unexpected is still going on.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Francisca.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.